There we go. Recording for anyone who can't make it synchronously.
Yeah, so there are a couple things that are going on. One is from the protect side, I think there is now starting to be an interest in viewing and managing what's running in a destination location from a SBOM perspective, from a just what's where, why, and who's accessing it perspective. That's a zero trust basically. So there's a whole thread of zero trust being pulled into that environment, and I think there have been some interesting conversations. One of my customers, we just had a conversation yesterday. They want to get more visibility into audit logging at the runners and the agent level, so that and there's a reason why it's both, right? Because runners still continue to be the mainstay for deployment into your traditional VMs and other things, and then the agent tends to be your Kubernetes area. So they kind of want a little bit more parity around what is available in terms of logging and dashboarding. The I don't want to say telemetry, because it's not really telemetry. It's more of the what is going on with the runner, right? Like what was deployed, when it was kicked off, how long did it take, were there any failures, where do secrets get kept? And then you're now starting to build into the more of the protection side, but sort of backing into the whole security aspects of the pipeline itself and the SBOM and all that. So it's like now it's starting to become this gigantic train of things, rather than, oh, we're just doing security here, oh, we're just protecting this thing here. Like it's now starting to meld into one big thing. So that's the new development I'm seeing in public sector for sure. So that's something I wanted to report back for you to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a great consideration. I know we acquired OpsTrace. To be frank, I have not looked into that in great detail yet. But I know at a very high level that collects a lot of telemetry for things like this, especially for Kubernetes. But presumably, if you were running your GitLab runners in Kubernetes, you might be able to get quite a lot of telemetry out of that as well. So yeah, I wonder if maybe there's some kind of a play there that we could, easily combine what we have with OpsTrace together with the agent and the runner, or maybe we even already have it today, quite honestly, and we just need to document how to set it all up. I don't really know, but that might be a potential way to solve for the sort of a problem.
Yeah. So for the runners, there seems to be something coming out. So that was a discussion we had with Darren Eastman from the runner team, and he mentioned that there is a way to collect a whole lot of metrics from the runners and push them into Prometheus and have like a dashboard there. It's not perfect because it's not dashboarding in GitLab user interface. You still have to kind of go into Prometheus and Grafana and watch these things, but there is a way. The problem that the customers seem to have with that is, so now I have to deploy Prometheus collectors on wherever my runner is running. So I have to add one more thing. There's nothing that comes out of the box. There's nothing that I can just kind of plug in and watch this data appear in GitLab. So it was a bit of a concern. I wouldn't say it was a terrible concern. It was just they come from a TeamCity view of the world where everything was given to them by TeamCity, and they are suddenly finding themselves not getting that data. So it's a little bit of a stretch for them.
Yeah, it seems like ideally we would just include the collector as part of the runner by default, and you could opt out of it or something if you didn't want it. And again, I do not know very much about ops trace. I kind of assume it has a Prometheus Grafana based backend, but I actually have no idea, you know. But you know, that way it would be all part of the same product if we could just feed it there instead and somehow display it in GitLab. That's an area of the product I'm not super familiar with though. So maybe I'll try to set up a conversation with our monitor PM and get their perspective on this topic. That's really interesting. You're right, it does span a lot of areas, right? It's like protect, runner, monitor, you know, kind of the convergence of all of these things, the agent.
Yeah, and the bigger need that has come up from a different customer that's very, very much forward leaning with regards to how they're implementing GitLab. So the customer that I'm talking about now is one that has adopted GitLab into their production systems as the de facto DevOps tool. So we're talking a large number of users using it. Happens to be self-managed, so a lot of instances are popping up. They still can't get their mind wrapped around one single instance, because underneath this one instance, there's like 12 or 13 entities that are feeding into this. So they are still kind of like, well, I don't want to share mine with my sibling entity, so I want my own. So there's a little bit of cracks there, but we're trying to unify them at a greater level. The thing is that they are now getting to a point where they're like, great, we've got GitLab, we want to use it, we are trying to deploy, but I can't get I can't get a couple of things. So there's a compliance part of it, right? I can't get the audit trail of who did what where. Very simply, it's not, I mean, we're still baking that. It's not 100% there yet. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is I have a running application. It did something and the log was was dropped into, say, Splunk or something. Combine that with GitLab. Can I correlate the two in any way to see if the attack came through GitLab or if the attack did not include GitLab? Like, how do I do that kind of analysis? And that my mind exploded at that point, because I was like, what are you even talking? Like, why would you even want to do that? But they apparently have a use case where they have to account for that sort of attacking. Mm-hmm. So I just want to bring that up from a protect perspective. It sort of brings this whole new aspect of what is it that we're monitoring? Are we monitoring the application that's developed from GitLab? The answer is yes. If that's yes, then how do we correlate what happens in GitLab with what happens outside of GitLab in that application? And if that's even a thought that we have considered before.
Yeah, that's sounds like they're trying to solve some tricky problems. Excuse me, I'm yawning, it was up late last night. Yeah, sounds like they've got some complex problems they're trying to solve.
Yeah, it's a financial system, so they need to have this kind of security planning in place in the event that they had a breach of some sort, maybe an inside actor breaching something, maybe an external. That's the point, right? Is they want to know how to do these things so they are enabled to do it when and if they need to do it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think, you know, in that scenario, it comes down to almost a little bit of like a mapping or modeling exercise where you say, if this attack were to come through GitLab, what are all the avenues where that might be possible, right? We know that the GitLab communicates with the GitLab agent for Kubernetes. We know the IP address of our GitLab server. You know, we know the port that communication is expected on. You know, if we see like perhaps, you know, communication on other ports besides that coming from the GitLab server, then I suppose that would be an indication that the GitLab server itself is compromised and somebody is trying to log into Kubernetes. And then, if it's on the port that's going to the GitLab agent for Kubernetes, then it becomes about monitoring that process, monitoring the agent itself and saying, okay, so if somebody from GitLab is sending a command to the GitLab agent, then what is that agent then doing? And so I think then it just comes down to a lot of traditional process monitoring. So it seems like they could take their existing logs that it sounds like they have that are being dropped into Splunk. And if they want to filter that down and see, what was GitLab's part and all of that, it really would just be some basic like IP filtering for the network traffic and then process filtering for everything else to see what was GitLab doing, amongst everything else that was happening there. And that's probably easier said than done, because one command can spawn another process, and so that definitely falls outside of like what GitLab is trying to solve for. That would be like a Splunk thing to connect those dots and show that chain of activity from one point to another. So yeah, I would imagine that it certainly can be done. It probably just takes some careful like modeling, threat modeling, and thinking through, what are all the different filters that we need to put on that data set to figure out what was happening. And then it sounds like what they're wanting to do, the next step from there is saying, okay, we were able to monitor that this command was executed by the GitLab Kubernetes agent, but it sounds like what they're wanting to do is actually trace that all the way back to GitLab itself and say, well, who or what executed that command? Yeah, that's a tricky one. Again, like there's no easy solution there. I don't know that that's going to be something that I would say it's unlikely that we like provide that as a feature of our product, because I think that's just going to come down to a little bit more custom tooling in, probably more in Splunk than in GitLab, of like, how do we correlate these logs? How do we put the right filters on things? How do we associate, this command? Sure, we've got the time, but is there a way to like bring it back to the project? You probably need some deep packet inspection to actually open up the network packets that are there so that you can see, where the commands originated from, like from which project, from which configuration file. And then you can pull the history of that file and get, through Git and GitLab to see who made the change, I would say. But yeah, that's a lot of like custom tooling and correlation.
Right.
I suppose
Yeah,
there
and
may be room for like a productized solution there somewhere, but I would venture to say that that's really far out on our roadmap comparatively.
yeah, no, and that's fair. I mean that, drawing the lines of scope is important. And we definitely don't want to like overreach into Splunk scope, for example, or anything like that. So that's interesting though that you mentioned that there might be some custom tooling to monitor what's going on in GitLab. And we might have some logging potentially that we might already be trapping. We just, have to expose it in some way. So I may need to, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No. So I think, so these are the things that I think we need to think of from a use case perspective across all of GitLab. And you see the concern here is the customer talked to me and they're like, how does GitLab solve this? And it's sort of a murder mystery for me right now, because I'm talking to Protect, which doesn't do this naturally. So my next stop is going to be Verify, and they're going to be like, well, we don't really do the logging. Go to monitoring, go to somebody else. I was okay, so I'll go to monitoring. They'll be like, well, you see what I'm saying? Like it's just a murder mystery at this point. There's no use case analysis. It's just specific stages, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I guess what I'm saying for this across all of the stages is that this may not be a problem that GitLab is trying to solve or wants to solve, right? So when it comes to like getting you the logs that you need to do that correlation, I think we can definitely support you in that. But doing the correlation itself, I think that would be a use case that sits outside of GitLab, would be my opinion.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I agree with you. I think data is what customer might be looking for. They think they want the functionality, which they can probably get from Splunk, as long as we are able to provide that data. And I think that's kind of where the question is how do we get the data? Is there a unified format? In some cases, yes. In many cases, no. Okay, if it's not unified, how do I unify it and get it into Splunk? How do I make sense of the data that I'm getting? So there are a lot of questions external to GitLab that need to be addressed, obviously. But I think GitLab needs to provide the data, which in some cases it doesn't at this point.
Yeah, well, so to answer your question on providing the data, I can help with that a little bit. You know, right now the GitLab agent for Kubernetes is driven through the configuration file. So I would expect that their production tool would be monitoring all of the network traffic and logs. So again, that would be outside of the scope of GitLab. Like they can do their own deep packet inspection and see all of our network traffic between the GitLab server and the agent. You know, I don't think we need to provide those logs. The only piece of information that they would really need from there coming from GitLab to correlate all the way back is basically information on any of the configuration file changes for the GitLab agent for Kubernetes. And that can be retrieved with basically a Git history. So I would kind of point them in that direction, saying, you know, they'll probably need to write something that fetches that Git history and then pushes some form of that into Splunk as a log. Effectively, it's not something that we like produce in our audit log, but it is stored in GitLab through the Git history, and they would just need to pull that history and present it to Splunk as a log. If I were to build this out myself, that's where I would start.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's just the way I need to nudge them is, you know, here's the data, here's how it's stored, and go figure it out. Yeah.
And then go push that into Splunk. Yep.
Yeah. Cool. That's all I had.
All right, great points.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I think one of the early on decisions we'll want to look at in that space is whether we want to, like y'all were talking about, throw our hat in the ring, right? Because there are a number of startups, and I suspect part of what we're seeing is the new age startups that focus on observability with security and compliance as their leading prong, if you will, setting new requirements in the market, right? So one of the decisions I feel like is whether GitLab wants to be the system or a cog in the system. And both of them are, you know, fine decisions as long as we make a conscious decision. There are some weird conversations that I've gotten myself into, like, should GitLab be monitoring itself, right? It's like philosophical stuff. But I survey the market pretty actively, startup market, and like Bionic, I think, is the one most people are familiar with. Torque is another one that uses security compliance as its leading foot. And then I think Sierra and Humanitech, those I went off memory, also do some stuff that's basically observability of all systems and ability to correlate data between them. They're like this, let me try to pronounce words today, amalgamation of SIEM systems, security analyzers, monitoring systems, logging systems, yada, yada. And most of them are in Series A, B, or C funding, so they're pretty early on. But there is a developing market out there that overlaps to some extent. I would say not a full extent with our product. Most of them are platforms that are very nascent, and you got to do a lot of customization, but their architecture certainly looks compelling. Let's just put it that way. As far as the reality on the ground, I couldn't tell you much about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And probably another good discussion to have with Monitor. Since they're really leading our observability play, again, I'm not familiar enough with ops trace to know how far we can go with that or not, but I would be really interested to hear their perspective. So like I said, I will definitely set up a time to chat with our Monitor PM, and I'll bring that up as well and try to get a sense of like where they're at and what kind of overlap might be there with security. Yeah, so thanks for all that feedback and for your thoughts. All right, well, thanks for chatting today. And it looks like we're at time. Feel free as always to reach out in the Slack channel or asynchronously throughout the month if you have anything else that comes up along the way.
Cool.
Got it.
Thank you.
Take care, y'all.
Yeah, have a good one.